This is a fairy tale that many of you grew up with. I'm sure that most of you remember the story of Cinderella, or Cindy, as she was known in some versions. And like most fairy tales, it had a good message. Be kind to others, and don't judge people by their appearance. But there were some other lessons embedded within the story, which could have been taken in different ways, depending on who was hearing the story. As an adult, I reread many of the classic fairy tales that I loved as a child, and was shocked at some of the things that I had completely missed when I was younger. So let me explain why this fairy tale was actually worse than you think. Cinderella is a poor young woman living with her evil stepmother and stepsisters. Her life is incredibly hard, and she is treated very badly. But one day, there is a royal ball being held at the palace, and Cindy wishes she could go. Well, her fairy godmother appears and waves her magic wand, and suddenly Cindy is transformed into a beautiful princess fit for the ball. But she must be home before midnight, because the spell only lasts until then. At the ball, Cindy meets the prince, and they dance all night. The prince is immediately smitten with Cindy, but she runs away before he can find out who she is. However, she leaves behind one of her golden slippers. The prince finds the shoe and becomes obsessed with finding its owner. He doesn't care about anything else. His advisors tell him that he should marry a woman of royal blood, but he refuses and insists that he must find the girl who fits the shoe. When the shoe fits Cindy, the prince believes that he has found his true love, and they get married and live happily ever after. Let's start with something that really shocked me. So Cinderella's father is dead. It is never explained how her mother died. There is no mention whatsoever of any other relatives. Now, this may not seem like a big deal, but in those days, if your father died and you were a woman, your nearest male relative would take care of you. In most cases, this would be your grandfather, your uncle, or your brother. But because all of these men had failed her, it was clear that Cinderella was seen as an outcast even before her father died. This was a common theme throughout many of the fairy tales written during this time period. For example, Snow White's father also remarried and then abandoned his daughter once his new wife told him that Snow White was more beautiful than she was. These stories taught young girls that they needed to be extremely careful when it came to choosing friends and family members. If you couldn't trust them, then they would abandon you at the first sign of trouble. And believe it or not, this was actually sound advice back in those days. Another thing that I want to point out is that Cinderella isn't actually her name. Her name is Ella, which comes from the name Eleanor. This is important because during the time that these fairy tales were being written, women were expected to be modest and quiet. They had to behave like perfect little angels. And if you weren't a lady, then you wouldn't be spoken about in polite company. So instead of saying a woman's name, they would refer to her as a certain lady. This is why we have so many female characters in fairy tales who are referred to as either a queen or a lady. But another thing that I noticed is that the stepsisters and the stepmother were never given names. This was on purpose. They didn't need names because they were nothing more than nameless, faceless creatures whose sole purpose was to represent evil. They had no redeeming qualities whatsoever. And even today, they are considered to be some of the most evil characters in literature. But what I found interesting was that they represent a type of jealousy that every woman experiences at some point in her life. It wasn't just Cinderella who was beautiful. The stepsisters were beautiful too. But as soon as Cindy became the prettiest girl in the room, everything changed. And they went from being kind sisters to hating Cindy's guts. But then there is the prince. Why did he fall in love with Cinderella? Well, in all fairy tales, the main character is always described as being beautiful. But in most cases, it's only the female characters who are judged by their appearance. For example, Beauty and the Beast is literally called Beauty and the Beast. She is the fairest of them all. Snow White's beauty is mentioned over and over again. But how often is the prince described as handsome? Very rarely, if at all. Instead, he is described as brave, kind, or honorable. So why did the prince fall in love with Cinderella? Well, the answer is quite simple. She was the only woman at the party who hadn't tried to flirt with him. Every other woman at the prince's ball had done everything that they could to catch his attention, but Cindy hadn't even realized who he was. And it was this mystery, this challenge that excited the prince. He wanted to conquer her heart. He wanted to prove himself worthy of such a prize. Most of the time, the female characters in fairy tales are too busy trying to attract the attention of the prince to realize that he is even there. And this is the biggest compliment that a woman could receive. To be honest, I think that the prince falling in love with Cinderella was a bit of a mistake. And when you think about it, that was the whole reason that the story had to be written in the first place. If he had fallen in love with one of the stepsisters, then he would have had to marry someone who was wicked and vain. And since they were related, this would make Cinderella miserable as well. So by making a mistake, all of their lives were changed forever. Now, the most famous line from this fairy tale is, of course, a minute, a second, a third there are none. And if you've ever read the original version of this fairy tale, then you know that this is actually not the case. There are 48 minutes left for Cinderella to return home, but she leaves after only 15. So why does everyone say that she has only a minute left? Well, this phrase is used in many different fairy tales to emphasize just how little time the protagonist has left. And I think that this is the reason why so many of us misquote the line. In most versions of the story, it doesn't matter why Cindy leaves early. All that matters is that she makes it home before the clock strikes 12. But if we examine the story a little closer, we will see that Cindy ran away from the prince because she knew that he would try to keep her there against her will. Remember, back in those days, women were expected to be submissive and obedient. And the prince felt that he had the right to tell Cindy what she could and couldn't do. This is why so many fairy tales teach us that we shouldn't judge people by their appearance, because the prince was clearly attracted to Cinderella's beauty, but he had no idea who she really was. And I'm sure that if he had spent some time talking to her, he would have realized that she wasn't the right choice for him. And finally, we come to the ending of the story where Cindy and the prince get married and live happily ever after. But just how happy are they? When you look at the fairy tales from a feminist point of view, you can see that these endings are actually quite disturbing. Remember, Cindy is still trapped. She is married to a man that she probably doesn't love. And now she has an entire kingdom to run. And let's not forget that children are expected to believe in these stories as well. So if they are told this fairy tale, they will grow up believing that getting married and giving up your life for the sake of a man is the ultimate goal in life. So there you have it. This fairy tale is actually much worse than you think. As an adult, I have to admit that I'm disappointed by some of the messages hidden within the stories that I loved as a child. But at the end of the day, they are still fun to watch, and they will continue to be enjoyed by children for many years to come. Thanks for watching.